This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Final Fantasy VIII was released all around the world at various points throughout 1999, and it did so with a great deal of expectation. Final Fantasy VII had been a smash hit just a few years before, and it raised the bar in terms of what gamers would expect from the Final Fantasy franchise, but also role-playing games in general. Yoshinori Kitase, who had also directed Final Fantasy VII, was the man assigned to try and create a game that would surpass what had come before, but he wasn't alone in this endeavour. Other departments at Square also went into overdrive, as did their publishing partners, and it meant that across its release on the PlayStation and then the PC, Final Fantasy VIII featured a whole host of rather interesting initiatives that would keep gamers occupied before its release, and if all went to plan, well into the future. The developers themselves introduced a whole host of small nuggets of information that only the most dedicated of fans would notice, and throughout this video, we're going to touch on a wide array of topics related to Final Fantasy VIII, from the gameplay mechanics that fueled the experience through to the game's expansive lore, and even some rather unorthodox merchandise. So be sure to subscribe if you've not done so already for more high quality Final Fantasy content, and from a subtle under the radar standalone release of Triple Triad through to expansive details about the world map that were never spoken about in the final game. Let's run through some very obscure facts about Final Fantasy VIII in our typical granular style. Oh, and don't forget to keep your eye out for lots of little bonus facts too. Before we do though, here's a message from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN, which can help you with your online safety and also help you to bypass content that's gated or censored based on your location. As many of us have been spending an increased amount of time at home online over the past year, it's become more apparent that certain content just isn't accessible depending on where you're based. For us, being able to remove those barriers has actually been very helpful, especially as Lauren has gone hardcore into learning Japanese. As we're based in the UK, very few shows on Netflix offer Japanese subtitles, but by switching our location, we have access to not only a huge array of new shows, but also better options for audio and subtitles. Surfshark VPN is also able to mask your IP and help protect against DDoS attacks, and it's available on all major devices with plugins for the most popular browsers. Today, we have a special offer for you. If you follow the link in the description below and use our code FINALFANTASY, you can get 83% off plus 3 extra months free, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you aren't happy, you can always just get your money back. Thanks again to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring the video, and now, on with the facts. Final Fantasy VII was filled with copious amounts of minigames, from the famed squat challenge through to the CPR sequence and of course the gold saucer. Many of these minigames left a lasting impression. But they were also constrained by in-game location, and when work started out on Final Fantasy VIII, the developers decided it would not be best to try and replicate the same approach. They still wanted there to be the occasional minigame that would appear as part of natural progression through the game, but they were keen to make sure a bigger focus was placed on a few well-developed minigames, as they believed this would allow them to have an even longer lasting impact, and one of the most famous, Triple Triad, was born from Kitase's desire to create a distraction that could be played anywhere in the game's world, and it was heavily influenced by the success of Magic the Gathering. This had been released in 1993 in North America and Europe, but it didn't manage to make its way to Japan until much later. When it did, the Japanese public took to the game and showed incredible levels of interest, so much so that the decision was even taken to host the 1998 World Championships in Yokohama. Realizing Magic the Gathering had global appeal, Kitase thought that replicating its appeal in-game would make sense, and Takeyoshi Nakazato, who is also one of the lead directors working on the battle system, was assigned to create a card game specifically for use with Final Fantasy VIII. Triple Triad would see players be able to play cards with NPCs throughout the world, with each region having specific rules. Cards could also be collected and traded, and even though there was an almost universal loathing of the random rule, Triple Triad proved to be a huge hit. Such was the nature of its success that a bright spark at Square had an idea. They believed Triple Triad could exist outside of the confines of Final Fantasy VIII, and sought to release it as a standalone application in Japan so that people would be able to collect cards and play against their friends. With hindsight, it seems like a very logical idea, but back in 1999, less than 30% of Japanese homes had access to the internet, and speeds were nowhere near what they are today. For that reason, Triple Triad was built so that it could be played against either an AI or between two computers that were on the same local area network, as opposed to relying on the internet. The next question was then distribution. Due to how niche the product became, Square chose not to release it as a truly standalone application, and it was bundled in with a software package that Digicube, Square's merchandising arm, were releasing for Japanese consumers who had PCs. It was called Final Fantasy VIII Desktop Accessories, and it could be purchased in local convenience stores like Family Mart or 7-Eleven for around 5,000 yen or $50. And alongside Triple Triad, it would feature custom icons as well as wallpapers, screensavers and themes that were designed for use in Windows 95 and Windows 98. There was also a specific Final Fantasy themed mail application to make sending emails more enjoyable. Unlike the in-game version of Triple Triad, the standalone version was quite different. You always started with the same 13 cards, and when entering into a match, the cards you could use were selected at random. You also couldn't select your opponent or manipulate the result should the match not be going in your favour, and if that wasn't bad enough, the AI would almost always have access to better cards, making progress towards obtaining all of the cards quite tricky. Needless to say, this was a very rare experience, and Square did not ever release it outside of Japan, but due to the evergreen nature of Triple Triad, it has since become available as part of the Portal app and Final Fantasy XIV, allowing many gamers around the world to enjoy its unique charm. Perhaps due to how much attention Final Fantasy gained upon its release, as well as the amount of backing it received from Sony, there was also a lot of attention placed on Final Fantasy VIII in the lead up to its launch. Publications jumped on any small updates that were revealed by Square relating to the game's mechanics, setting and its cast of characters, and official US PlayStation magazine chose to do a huge feature in their September 1999 edition. It spanned 9 pages, included custom artwork, and divulged information such as Chocobo's world even being localized and included in the base game should the Pocket Station ever receive a release stateside. But even though it was quite comprehensive, it paled in comparison to the huge fanfare Final Fantasy VIII received here in the UK ahead of its release. Despite having a near identical name, due to being owned by 2 separate publishing houses, the 2 official PlayStation magazines had very little in common, and this was evidenced by their approach to Final Fantasy VIII, as in the UK, OPM decided to release an entire special edition magazine dedicated to Square's upcoming release and everything else they were working on at the time. With hindsight, it was pretty insane, and it showed just how much interest there was in Square as a company back in their heyday. Detailed within this special magazine were extensive breakdowns of what to expect in Final Fantasy VIII, with a focus on key story segments. There were also exclusive interviews with the creators, and they even explored how Final Fantasy VIII tied in with other properties being produced by Square, such as The Spirits Within, which at the time was simply called Final Fantasy the Movie. Space was also dedicated to look at the future, with a preview of Chocobo Racing and even prospective opinions about upcoming releases, with mentions of The Bouncer, Final Fantasy X, and Urgeist 2. The other huge incentive to purchase was the inclusion of a world-exclusive version of the Final Fantasy VIII demo. The demo had previously been released in Japan and North America, where it was shipped alongside the release of Brave Fencer Musashi, as well as being bundled in with orders from Pizza Hut, but the UK demo was much more polished and was also much easier to complete by comparison. Sticking on the subject of the demo, it's well known that there were numerous changes made between the various iterations of the demo that were released when compared to what was seen within the final product. One of the more notable changes was seen with Squall's face, but it was the ending sequence that featured changes that probably stood out the most. Not only was the huge mechanical spider defeated by a random member of SEED manning a machine gun, as opposed to Quistis, but Rinoa was featured instead of Selphie, something that led to Rinoa still featuring during this cutscene in the final game. But there were also quite a few other interesting tweaks housed within, and perhaps one of the most obscure is that XATM092 didn't actually feature in the demo. Instead, what we saw was an earlier version of the monstrous automaton called XATM082. From a visual perspective, it was identical to its predecessor, but some of XATM082's attacks had different names, and it was actually impossible to defeat owing to a lack of strength within the party and a much harsher time limit applied for the sequence. It was also not possible to hide from XATM082 in the pub, something that in the final game would, of course, prevent the ending FMV sequence from happening, as there would no longer be a chase. It's never been revealed why the name of the enemy was changed, and it may have just been a symbolic gesture from the development staff to denote its appearance in the demo. Following the establishment of DigiCube, Square were always keen to expand the array of merchandise they offered alongside their games. They had actually been offering merchandise for many, many years, even setting up an official shop in the early 90s to sell merchandise for Final Fantasy 1 through 3, but DigiCube allowed them to break new grounds by having dedicated teams responsible for production, distribution, and perhaps most importantly, making sure they had all the right partnerships available to them. We spoke in a previous video about how this allowed Square to start producing some high quality music boxes that unfortunately became extremely rare when DigiCube went bankrupt, but it also allowed for the creation of other, more curious ranges, and perhaps one of the most unique is the Final Fantasy VIII Papercraft range. This particular notion has come back into popular consciousness in recent times, and Square Enix even decided to take down a popular fan creator before offering their own line of non-paper merchandise that looked strikingly similar. But back in 1999, Square did not need to rely on fan creators as they produced their own official origami book for Final Fantasy VIII that taught people how to recreate some of their favourite elements of the game from paper. Alongside an accompanying CD that contained live-action tutorials, the 128-page book featured visual guides for how to create various Guardian forces, such as Cactuar and Carbuncle, and with enough dexterity, it also showed how to create Odin out of paper, which is crazy. What's also crazy is that due to the sheer volume and scope of the merchandise being produced for Final Fantasy VIII, they even commissioned an action figure for Angelo, Rinoa's faithful dog, but it could only be acquired as part of a very specific set, and it wasn't ever released as a standalone piece. Square released a few different ranges of figures for Final Fantasy VIII, and the set that contained Angelo, called Final Fantasy VIII Extra Soldiers, was produced by Bandai. Acting as a continuation of the Final Fantasy VII Extra Knights range, which featured 6 of the game's protagonists as well as Sephiroth and 2 mascots, Final Fantasy VIII Extra Soldiers had 2 different release formats. The 6 main protagonists were released as standalone figures alongside Laguna and Cypher, but there were also 2 collections created, and these contained different figures. Gone were Quistis and Irvine, and in their place were 3 bonus figurines for Edea, Amumba, and Angelo. And as a bonus fact here, Angelo, whose full name is Sant'Angelo di Roma, was named as such by the creators to hint at Rinoa's wider role within the narrative. Angelo also had some interesting character quirks revealed in the Final Fantasy VIII Ultimania guidebook, such as her hatred for any kind of spicy food, but also a hatred for all kinds of dog food. These rather specific dietary requirements were a result of Rinoa constantly feeding Angelo her leftovers, which is why Angelo's diet consists of sushi, apples, yogurt, peanut butter, and white chocolate, even though it's strongly advised that dogs do not eat white chocolate. Final Fantasy VIII was actually the first game in the franchise to receive an Ultimania guidebook. Before then, Square worked with various publishers like NTT, Enterbrain and Famitsu to release a wide range of books to support the release of their games, and Final Fantasy VII received Final Fantasy VII Kaitai Shinsho the Complete, which was something of a precursor to the Ultimania. Ever since the Ultimania guidebooks have been introduced, they have become synonymous within the fanbase due to the treasure troves of information they contain about each of the games they're related to. This has ranged from concept art to information about development, interviews with the developers, and loads of extra lore details that help to flesh out the world and its characters in a level of detail just not possible within the games themselves. Final Fantasy VIII was no different, and the specific piece of information we're going to talk about today is the world map. Within the final game, the world map felt very fleshed out. There were numerous continents, subcontinents, and islands, and cities and villages were plentiful. It was also clear how everything was connected, but what was not disclosed in the game was that the developers had gone into much more detail, providing names for the continents and various regions that existed throughout the world. Balam Garden, for example, as well as the town of Balam, were situated within the Alkald Plains region, which is next to the Gulug Mountains, a very clear tribute to Mount Gulug from the original Final Fantasy. The orphanage was situated in the Cape of Good Hope, and the desert prison sits within the rather humorously named Dingo Desert. In the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary Ultimania, the developers also chose to share an earlier iteration of the Final Fantasy VIII world map, which showed Balam Garden as a regency, and there was also meant to be a huge road going through Esther called the Yellow Brick Road, perhaps included due to Katase's love for film. And that brings us onto our final obscure fact, which relates to the infamous draw system. This was created by Takatsugu Nakazawa, and it would feed into the junction system as a way of helping players to better manage their spells, stats, and affinities. It would see players be able to literally draw various spells from specific points throughout the world, as well as each of the game's enemies. These spells would then be stocked in the player's inventory and would have finite uses, making it something of a hybrid of the systems originally seen within Final Fantasy I and III, where spells could only be cast a certain amount of times as opposed to consuming MP. The amount of each spell drawn was determined by a formula that took into consideration the character's level and the target's level, but most people aren't aware that each individual spell in the game also had a difficulty associated with it that would restrict the number of spells that could be drawn, and the spell with the highest resistance was Apocalypse. This spell, which could only be drawn from Ultima Sia herself, had a draw resist of 46, which was marginally higher than Ultima, another situational spell that could only be drawn from Ultima and Omega Weapon, but could also be obtained from draw points that were situated around the world, such as on the island closest to heaven and the island closest to hell. And with that, I think we're done. We've run through 7 facts about Final Fantasy VIII that we feel you probably didn't know, and as always, we threw in a load of little bonus facts for good measure. Nonetheless, I'm pretty sure there were some amongst you who still knew them all. Let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, thanks again to the sponsor of this video, Surfshark VPN. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.